Hello everyone, my name is Roy Magara. I'm an employment solicitor at Magara Law. We're an employment law firm. We take care of any employment related matter for clients in England and in Wales. And in this video, Werner Fullerton and I are going to be talking about autism, reasonable adjustments, and what rights do people with autism have in the workplace. Before I do, I'll give the floor to you, Werner, to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Wenna Fullerton. I'm a neurodivergent consultant and HR professional and have my own business, the Neurodivergent Collective. We support neurodivergent individuals in all walks of life, particularly in the workplace, in education, and pre and post diagnostic as well.
So, first question, what is autism? Over to you, Werner.
So the simple answer to this is it is a neurodevelopmental condition. As someone who is autistic, I think my lived experience answer is it's very much who I am, more of an identity. So I never refer to myself as having autism. I very much always describe myself as being autistic, and how I see the world can be very, very different to those who are not autistic. So being autistic means that many of us have a different sensory profile. So we may find that we struggle with kind of sensory avoidance, sensory seeking as well. Communication can look differently, and it can really affect how our nervous system works as well. We often see that whilst there's no kind of real strong links in terms of, or kind of physical ailments, being autistic can kind of carry with it. It is very much because we often see a lot of kind of high levels of anxiety, like many other neurodevelopmental conditions, that can lead to other kind of physical ailments that come with it, because again, how we kind of intercept the world can be quite stressful. So when we're thinking about support, it's really imperative that we get the right support in place for people.
Thank you for that. And the next question we're going to talk about is what rights does someone have if they disclose the fact that they are autistic to their employer? So I'll start off just by saying that someone disclosing that they're autistic to their employer is their personal decision. There's no legal obligation per se to do that, but in some cases it will be beneficial to do so because opening up to your employer that you're autistic can, or it certainly ought to, mean that you access the necessary support and accommodations. So if someone does choose to disclose the fact that they are autistic, then they have the right to what are called reasonable adjustments. And we'll talk about that a bit later on. But essentially, as far as the reasonable adjustment is concerned, an employer has a legal duty to make legal adjustments to an autistic person's work environment, and that helps them do their job. It ensures that they're not suffering any less favorable treatment, known or unbeknown to the employer. And what that could look like, well, again, we'll talk about more particular examples in a moment, but what that could look like are things like changes to the role or working hours or even the physical workplace. Also, as far as legal obligations are concerned in that regard, there is a protection from discrimination. I'm not necessarily going to go too far into the law here, but essentially, anyone who has a condition, and in this case, we're talking about autism, which can substantially negatively affect their day-to-day normal activities, then that is quite likely to be classed as a disability under the Equality Act 2010. And that also includes harassment and unfair treatment, which can look like something called victimization. And victimization, in brief terms, is where if someone discloses that they're autistic to their employer, and then as a result of that, they then suffer some sort of less favorable treatment, then that could be seen as harassment or victimization or discrimination in that regard. And lastly, before I pass on to you, Anna, on this particular topic, an employer has a legal obligation to keep your medical information confidential. There's a confidential discussion between you and your employer and in terms of how they can help you. So when I'll pass on to you in terms of rights that someone who is autistic has if they disclose that fact to their employer, over to you.
Yes, I think there's it can feel very, very overwhelming disclosing. There's always a very big challenge over the kind of thinking about, do I disclose, do I not? And as you said, Roy, earlier, there's no legal obligation for someone to disclose. It's a very personal choice to make, but it can be also a very, very difficult choice. So I think knowing that, you should be protected under the Equality Act 2010, knowing what your rights are very, very important, and knowing what to expect and to legally expect and I think morally expect as well, I think from employers is very, very important. I think in terms of, I think the rights in general, it can feel very almost people could feel very powerless at times. Again, trying to make that choice because they may be worried about discrimination or just simply being so whether that's victimization or harassment, um, it may be that they are worried about being treated differently or the judgment they may face. But it's looking at the rights and how they will, should, and they definitely ought to outweigh the kind of the negatives, the kind of the what ifs. And I think it's very common for people to wonder about those what ifs when they're thinking about their rights. But their rights are there, and the law is there to protect them. And hopefully, it does that.
Yes, thank you. And the another important takeaway is if someone is facing challenges or feel that their rights are being violated, then the important thing to do is to seek advice. I sound biased, but absolutely seek advice from an employment solicitor or indeed a disability support organization, the neurodivergent organization collective rather too. And let's move on from that and talk about reasonable adjustments for autistic employees. And as you rightly said, when someone disclosing their autism or that they're autistic to their employer is a significant step. And once they've taken that step, the next crucial stage quite often is to discuss reasonable adjustments, which, as we talked about earlier, are those changes to one's work environment or role that enable them to perform their job or their role effectively. And I find when advising clients in this particular space, there are a number of common, shall I call it, reasonable adjustments that that we look to try and implement. And one of those, for example, is communication support. And in many respects, that includes providing just clear and concise instructions, or even using visual aids if need be. Another common one is noise reduction, so creating quieter workspaces, providing noise cancellation headphones, allowing remote working or hybrid working. And that I often find helps with things like sensory adjustments that can be made. Particularly if we're looking at an open plan space, there's typically usually just one sort of set of lighting, but actually that kind of setting may not work for someone with autism, or temperature, for example, or environmental factors. These are kind of just bullet points, as it were, for want of a better phrase, but I seem to find these are some quite common adjustments that come up. What would you say, Wenna?
I think I mean, they are all really, really great adjustments that can be implemented and again have such a big positive impact on people and that also very cost effective for employers as well. I know that's often a concern around implementing reasonable adjustments. Um, I think another one that I certainly see is kind of managing workload. So, if we're thinking about kind of flexible working, what does that look like? And this will be different for each employer because depending on their flexible working policy or whether they have a flexible working policy in place. And flexible working does not necessarily mean that people can work, whenever they feel like, throughout the, the week. And actually, for someone that's autistic, providing some structure, even if that's loose structure, can be really beneficial. And then in terms of kind of managing that workload, a very common issue that I see arise, that can be really detrimental to autistic individuals, and I'm sure a lot of people as well, because it's not very sustainable, is having things like back-to-back meetings with no breaks. So often we'll see that someone has, been working from 8 a.m. till 12 p.m. They'll have, a short lunch break, and then they'll go straight back into a full afternoon of back-to-back meetings. So they're either stuck at their desk or they're in face-to-face meetings, and that is a huge demand on their energy levels that look very different to neurotypical employees. And the demands on communication. You often find as well that many autistic individuals mask, and especially if they're feeling quite tired or are feeling a bit unsure about the environment, they may mask, and that's even more kind of exhausting, both mentally and physically. So thinking about some really simple things that we can implement in, that scenario would be to make sure that someone is allowed to take more regular breaks, that they prioritize kind of, because it often happens where there's a meeting for a meeting, or a meeting that could be an email, and thinking about, what is the non-negotiable kind of, what are those meetings they absolutely have to attend that week. Is there, working with their line manager to think about how can we put some kind of breaks in here, how can we shorten some even regular meetings, so where a meeting's booked in for an hour, can we make that 45 minutes? Can we shorten it even more? I think we often hear things like, oh, is this employee, and this is a general statement for all employees, but it's often, will be in a job description, you've got to be a team player. But being a team player as an autistic individual, can sometimes look a bit different. I think that contribution and the kind of performance of an employee might look a bit different, but it could certainly still be at that same level, and kind of, surpass expectations. But it just, sometimes we need these smaller kind of intricate, sometimes very specific adjustments put in place. So thinking about the, kind of extra breaks, making sure that someone has that time to decompress. So whether they're at work in an office environment or they're working from home, things like there's equipment that can be used as well. So things like standing desks, they're great for autistic employees, also great for employees with ADHD. So allowing that kind of movement, and that can really help in terms of kind of how they perform, how they're processing information. Also, again, having that quiet space, and whether that's at home or in an office environment, thinking about, do they have a place where they can go, where they can decompress when things do get too much? So overall, when we're thinking about someone's calendar, when we're thinking about, someone's work environment, is there that option to just take a step back and take a breath? Because sometimes that's needed, to be able to, to kind of make their role sustainable, make sure that their overall well-being is sustained, and that, that small kind of part of, support that can be implemented can be really, really valuable for someone.
Thank you. Really good points there. And as we journey on this particular topic, I think it'll be helpful for people to understand how or what things they need to be thinking about for if they choose to approach their employer, their line manager about this space. And a couple of key points as we look into that are, firstly, when that conversation happens, the important thing is you don't have to accept the first adjustments that are offered, because the reality is sometimes adjustments are offered, but they just don't work, or they're just not suitable, or they're just not right. And so it's not a one-trick pony. In short, discussions need to be open and current, and things can chop and change over time. Like for anyone, for example, who may be neurotypical, things change over time. The same thing applies to those in this particular space too. So in this case, those who are autistic. I'd also recommend documenting all conversations and requests. That in particular can also be really helpful if there needs to be some kind of escalation. Escalation doesn't always need to be negative. It just means you may be helpful escalation for occupational health, for example, or another medical practitioner who might be able to at least look at the history and then provide some greater assistance there. Or indeed, I appreciate escalation can also mean from a legal perspective as well, if need be. So let's say the individual has taken support from a disability organization, for example, like the Neurodivergent Collective, or they've sought legal advice. When it comes to approaching the employer about reasonable adjustments, what sort of things, Werner, would you suggest would be helpful in terms of preparing for that conversation, or how that conversation should look?
So this will look slightly different for everyone because it will depend on I think there's a lot of courage I think it takes to kind of approach your employer because there's a lot of unknown. It will, I think, depend largely on the relationship with their line manager. Um, some some organizations and businesses also have kind of dedicated teams that, that will also support around this. So whether they have things like a reasonable adjustment process or a policy, and that's kind of more formalized. Um, but in terms of kind of approaching it to begin with, um, whether that needs to be a conversation prior to things kind of being put in writing. And as you said, Roy, like everything needs to be documented. Um, it's really important to go into it trying to work together so that that onus on what those reasonable adjustments should be is not solely on the employee or solely on the employer, and that is a collaborative approach. Sometimes, again, as I mentioned, that may take other professionals to kind of step in and provide guidance and advice there. Um, but also kind of being open-minded and knowing from both sides that if it has been agreed, a certain say list or a document. So sometimes you'll have a working document that will list the reasonable adjustments that will be implemented. It's useful to understand when they'll be implemented, how as well, but also that, as you mentioned, Roy, things change and that this should be reviewed on a regular basis because reasonable adjustments, whether the employee and the employer are very happy that they are implemented, sometimes in practice they just do not work. So it's it could feel quite deflating, especially to the employee, that they've been maybe looking forward to having a certain type of support implemented. So that could be software, that could be equipment, it could be things like it could be kind of peer support in the workplace, and or coaching. And if that's not working for them, feeling stuck or feeling like that's it, they've got their list and there's no movement there. But that really needs to be flexible and it needs to be reviewed because there are so many external factors, I think, and kind of variables where things can change. So I think just keeping that under review and having, again, that collaborative approach is really important when kind of not just approaching, but also kind of, I think, thinking of the future and making that more future proof.
Yeah, absolutely key points. Being open and honest about their needs, focusing on the adjustments. And I suppose one way is equally not just on how the adjustments will benefit the employee, but how in turn the fact that the employee is now working to the best of their ability also benefits the company as well. Really good points there, Winnet. Thank you for your time. how can people get in touch with you?
So people can get in touch with us at www.theneurodivergentcollective.co.uk.
Thank you. And if anyone needs any employment law support, our website is www.magaralaw.co.uk. Our details are in the description and in the comments. Thank you.